There are mistakes that don't look like mistakes when you're making them. You don't yell. You don't leave. You don't stop loving. You just stay quiet and tell yourself it's peace. I did that during her pregnancy. And years later, she told me how alone she felt. That's when I understood. Silence doesn't protect love, it slowly breaks it. There are some mistakes you don't recognize as mistakes until years later, not because you were careless, not because you didn't love enough, but because you stayed quiet when your voice mattered most. I didn't yell, I didn't leave, I didn't abandon her. I just stayed silent. And for a long time, I told myself that silence was the same as peace. It wasn't. If you're listening right now, I want you to pause for just a second and ask yourself something simple, something honest. Have you ever looked back at a season of your life and thought, I didn't know then what I know now? Most of us have, especially when it comes to pregnancy, especially when it comes to our daughters, especially when it comes to the things we didn't say. I want to be clear about something from the very beginning. This isn't a story about abuse. It's not about yelling or cruelty or neglect in the way people usually imagine it. This is a story about something quieter than that. This is a story about emotional absence, about being physically present but emotionally distant, about thinking you are doing the right thing and realizing later that you were wrong, very wrong. I didn't understand that at the time. Back then, I truly believed I was being respectful. I thought I was giving her space. I thought I was staying out of the way. I thought silence meant support. But silence can be loud, and silence can leave scars. I still remember the day she told me she was pregnant, not because it was dramatic, not because there were tears or shouting or doors slamming. No, it was quiet, too quiet. She stood in my kitchen with her hands folded in front of her, like she was waiting for judgment, even though none had been spoken. Her voice was calm, but her eyes weren't. I'm pregnant, she said. Just like that. No buildup, no explanation, no asking how I felt about it. And I remember nodding. Just nodding. I didn't ask how she was feeling. I didn't ask if she was scared. I didn't ask what she needed from me. I said something simple, something neutral. Well, we'll figure it out. Have you ever said that? We'll figure it out. It sounds supportive, doesn't it? Sounds calm, sounds mature. But sometimes we'll figure it out is just another way of saying, I don't know how to show up for you. She nodded back at me, gave a small smile, and that was it. She went to her room, and I went back to what I was doing. And right there, that was the first quiet mistake. Now, I know some of you listening might be thinking, well, what else was she supposed to do? You can't force your way into somebody's pregnancy. And you're right, at least partly. At the time, I told myself a whole story to make my silence feel responsible. I told myself she was grown. I told myself she needed independence. I told myself I didn't want to smother her. I told myself I didn't want to make her feel judged. I told myself I was being respectful. And if I'm being honest, and we're being honest here, some of that silence came from fear. Fear of saying the wrong thing. Fear of reopening old wounds. Fear of admitting that I didn't know how to help her. So I chose the safest option. I chose quiet. No opinions, no questions, no emotional weight. Just silence. And if you had asked me back then, do you love her? I would have said yes without hesitation. I loved her deeply. But love without expression can feel like indifference. That's something nobody told us growing up. We grew up learning how to keep our feelings neat, how to stay composed, how to mind our business. Some of us grew up hearing children should be seen and not heard, and without realizing it, we carried that lesson straight into adulthood. We thought that was wisdom. Turns out, a lot of it was survival. And survival habits don't always make good parenting tools, especially when your child is carrying a child of their own. As the months went on, her pregnancy progressed. Doctor's appointments came and went. Baby plans were made quietly. There was stress in the air, the kind you can feel but don't know how to name. I noticed she stopped sharing details. She didn't talk about how tired she was. She didn't talk about her fears. She didn't talk about the nights she couldn't sleep. And instead of leaning in, I leaned back. I told myself, she'll come to me if she needs me. That was another mistake, because sometimes people don't come to you, not because they don't need you, but because they don't feel invited. And silence doesn't feel like an invitation. It feels like a closed door. Let me ask you something, and you don't have to answer out loud. Have you ever waited for someone to ask for help, only to realize later they were waiting for you to offer it? That space in between, that's where damage happens. Quiet damage. The kind nobody talks about until it's too late. There was one moment in particular that I think about now more than I ever thought I would. At the time, it didn't feel important. She was sitting on the couch, rubbing her stomach, staring at nothing. I asked, "You okay?" She said, "Yeah, just tired." And I accepted that answer. I didn't sit down beside her. I didn't ask another question. I didn't say, "Talk to me." I let the moment pass. And moments like that don't come back. They don't announce themselves. They don't warn you. They just disappear. At the time, I told myself, she doesn't want to talk. But the truth is, I didn't know how to listen. Sometimes silence isn't about respecting boundaries. Sometimes silence is about avoiding discomfort, avoiding emotions we were never taught how to handle. And pregnancy brings up everything: old hurts, old patterns, old unmet needs. And when you don't know how to sit with those things, you get quiet. Somewhere along the way, something shifted between us. She didn't become cold, she didn't become angry, she became careful. And instead of asking why, I adjusted to the distance. I told myself we were fine. We weren't. We were just polite. And polite relationships don't survive emotional storms. What I didn't realize then, and what still hurts to admit now, is that my silence during her pregnancy planted a seed of emotional separation. I didn't see it grow, I didn't feel it take root. But years later, when she finally told me how alone she felt during that time, I understood something that shook me to my core, the kind of realization that doesn't come gently, the kind that arrives all at once, like a truth you can't unhear. And once you hear it, you can never go back to who you were before. After the baby was born, people assumed things would get better. That's what we're told, isn't it? That a new baby heals things, that love fills in the gaps, that whatever was missing before will somehow work itself out once the child arrives. I believed that too. I told myself, once the baby gets here, everything will fall into place. But babies don't fix emotional distance. They expose it. When she came home from the hospital, the house felt different. Not bad, just changed. There were diapers stacked in corners, soft blankets draped over furniture, that quiet newborn smell in the air that makes time feel slower. I held the baby. I smiled. I said all the right things people expect you to say. She's beautiful. She looks just like you. You did good. And on the surface, it looked like I was showing up. But underneath all of that, the silence was still there. I didn't ask her how she was really doing. I didn't ask about the nights she cried in the bathroom so no one would hear her. I didn't ask how lonely she felt, even when the house was full. I assumed motherhood would give her what my voice never did. That was another mistake. She moved through those early days like someone who didn't want to take up too much space. She did what needed to be done, fed the baby, changed the diapers, kept going. And I watched her do it, from a distance. I told myself I was helping by not interfering, by not offering opinions, by not stepping on her toes. But what I was really doing was staying comfortable. And comfort has a way of disguising itself as kindness. There was one afternoon that stays with me now. The baby had finally fallen asleep, and she sat at the table with her head resting in her hands. I could tell she was exhausted, the kind of tired that sleep doesn't fix. I asked, "You all right?" She hesitated before answering. That pause should have told me everything. But when she finally said, "Yeah, I'm okay," I let that be enough. I went back to what I was doing, and later that night when I heard her crying softly through the wall, I stayed in my room. I told myself she needed privacy. I told myself I didn't want to make things worse. I told myself a lot of things. But the truth was, I didn't know how to sit with her pain, and instead of learning, I retreated. You know, there's a kind of silence that feels heavy. Not angry, not loud, just heavy. It sits in a room. It lingers in conversations that never quite happen. It shows up in the way people stop asking for things. That silence moved in with us, and slowly it became normal. Weeks turned into months. The baby grew. She grew too, in ways I didn't fully notice at the time. She became more independent, more self-contained. She stopped expecting much from me emotionally, and I mistook that for strength. I thought, she's handling it. What I didn't understand was that people don't stop needing support just because they stop asking for it. Sometimes they stop asking because they've already learned the answer. There was a moment, years later, when she finally said something that made everything click. But before I get to that, I need to tell you about the lie I was telling myself back then. The lie was simple. I told myself, if something was really wrong, she would tell me. That sounds reasonable, doesn't it? But it ignores something important. A lot of us were raised to believe that expressing need is a burden, that asking for emotional support is weakness, that you should handle your business quietly, especially women, especially Black women. So when she stayed quiet, she wasn't saying everything was fine. She was doing what she had been taught. And I was doing the same thing. Two people, both silent, both loving, both missing each other. There were family gatherings where she laughed and smiled. People would say, "She's such a good mother." And she was. But nobody saw what happened after everyone went home. Nobody saw how alone she felt. Nobody saw how much she wished someone would just sit beside her and say, "You don't have to do this by yourself." I never said that. And every time I think about that now, it hits me in the chest. Because those are words that can't be replaced. Time passed. Life moved on. The baby became a toddler, then a child. And on the outside, we looked fine. But on the inside, something had shifted permanently. Our conversations became surface level. Updates instead of sharing. Information instead of connection. I told myself this was just how relationships change as children grow up. I told myself it was normal. But deep down, there was a quiet discomfort I didn't want to name. It's amazing how long you can live with something unfinished as long as nobody forces you to look at it. Then one day, long after the pregnancy, long after the sleepless nights, she said something that cracked everything open. We were sitting together, not arguing, not emotional, just talking. And somehow the conversation drifted back to that time in her life. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You know, that was one of the loneliest times of my life." I laughed softly, almost out of reflex, and said, "Really? You had so many people around you." She looked at me then, really looked at me, and she said, "That's the thing. I was never alone, but I felt alone." Those words landed hard. I didn't know what to say. She went on, slowly, carefully, like she didn't want to hurt me. She told me how she felt during her pregnancy, how scared she was, how unsupported she felt emotionally. She told me she thought my silence meant disappointment. That part nearly broke me, because that was never my intention. But intentions don't erase impact. She told me there were nights she wanted to call out for me, but didn't, because she didn't want to feel like a burden. And as she spoke, memory after memory came rushing back. All the moments I stayed quiet, all the times I chose comfort over connection. And suddenly I could see it clearly. My silence hadn't protected her, it had isolated her. That realization didn't come gently. It came like a wave. And once it hit, I couldn't pretend anymore. I apologized. Not the quick kind, not the defensive kind. I apologized for real. But even as I did, I knew something painful was true. Some apologies come too late to change the past. They can heal, yes. They can open doors, but they can't give someone back what they needed when they needed it. And that's the part that stays with you. That's the part you carry. Because you can't go back and sit on that couch. You can't ask that follow-up question. You can't walk into that room when the crying starts. All you can do is acknowledge what you missed and live with it. That's the quiet mistake I can't take back. And in the next part, I want to talk about what I learned from it, what silence taught me, and what I wish I had understood sooner. Because if there's one thing I know now, it's that being present isn't just about being there. It's about letting someone feel heard. And that lesson came at a cost. After that conversation, I didn't sleep much. Not because I was tired, but because my mind wouldn't let me rest. I kept replaying moments I had forgotten, small moments, ordinary moments, and suddenly they weren't small anymore. They were opportunities I missed. I thought about how many times I had chosen silence because it felt safer, how many times I had convinced myself that staying quiet was the mature thing to do. And for the first time, I asked myself a hard question. What if my silence wasn't kindness at all? What if it was avoidance? That question sat with me for a long time, because once you ask it, you can't unask it. I started noticing a pattern in my life, not just with her, but with other people too. I realized I had spent years believing that love meant not rocking the boat, that caring meant not asking uncomfortable questions, that respect meant staying out of the way. But emotional connection doesn't grow in still water. It grows in conversation, in presence, in the willingness to sit with discomfort. I thought back to my own upbringing, how emotions were handled quietly, how struggles were carried privately, how nobody really sat down and said, "Tell me how you're doing, and I'm going to stay right here while you do." We survived by staying strong, by not complaining, by keeping things moving, and I carried that mindset straight into motherhood. I didn't realize that what helped me survive was hurting my ability to connect. There's a difference between strength and silence. I didn't know that back then. I know it now. After she told me how alone she felt, I wanted to fix everything at once. I wanted to explain myself, to tell her I didn't mean to hurt her, to show her how much I loved her. But love doesn't rewrite memory. All it can do is acknowledge it. So instead of trying to defend myself, I started listening differently. When she spoke, I didn't rush to respond. I didn't try to correct her experience. I didn't say, "That's not how it was." I let her tell her story. And that wasn't easy, because hearing how your actions affected someone you love can feel like looking in a mirror you've avoided for years. But it was necessary. I learned something important during that time. People don't always remember what you did, but they remember how alone they felt when they needed you. That realization stayed with me. I began thinking about all the women who might be listening to this right now. Women who raised children the best way they knew how. Women who stayed strong when nobody checked on them. Women who thought silence was respect because that's what they were taught. And I wondered how many of us are carrying regrets we never talk about. Not the loud regrets, not the obvious ones, the quiet ones. The ones that don't show up in photo albums. The ones that don't come with dramatic stories. The kind that live in memories of conversations that never happened. I started to understand that emotional neglect doesn't always look like cruelty. Sometimes it looks like distance. Sometimes it looks like politeness. Sometimes it looks like, I didn't want to interfere. And the hardest part is that at the time, it feels reasonable. It feels responsible. You don't realize the cost until much later. By then, the moment has passed. The pregnancy is over. The baby is grown. Life has moved on. And all you're left with is understanding. I had to accept that I couldn't go back and be the person she needed then. All I could do was be different now. That meant speaking up more, asking questions, sitting in uncomfortable conversations instead of avoiding them. It meant learning to say things like, I don't know what to say, but I want to be here with you. I wish I had known that during her pregnancy. I wish I had known that presence doesn't require perfect words. It just requires showing up. I think about that couch sometimes. The way she sat there, rubbing her stomach, staring into space. At the time, it was just another moment in the day. Now, it feels like a turning point I didn't recognize. That's the thing about quiet mistakes. They don't announce themselves. They don't demand attention. They slip by unnoticed until it's too late. If you're listening to this and something in you feels familiar, I want you to hear this part clearly. It's not too late to speak. It may be too late to change the past, but it's not too late to change how you show up now. Silence doesn't heal relationships. Honesty does. Presence does. And sometimes love sounds like saying, I see you. I'm here. Tell me what you're feeling. I didn't understand that during her pregnancy. I understand it now. And if there's one thing I hope comes from this story, it's that someone listening will choose to speak when their voice still has time to matter. Because some mistakes can't be taken back, but some can still be prevented. And that makes all the difference. As time went on, I started paying attention to moments I used to overlook. The pauses in conversations, the way people answer, I'm fine, without looking up. The difference between someone talking and someone being heard. I realized how often we mistake calm for connection. Just because there's no argument doesn't mean there's understanding. Just because someone isn't complaining doesn't mean they aren't struggling. And just because things look peaceful on the outside doesn't mean something isn't breaking quietly on the inside. I began thinking about how many times during her pregnancy I chose not to ask the second question. How are you felt safe, but how are you really felt risky. Because that question asks something of you, too. It asks you to listen. It asks you to stay present. It asks you to carry something that isn't yours, but has been entrusted to you. Back then, I didn't know how to do that. I didn't know that listening doesn't mean fixing, that being there doesn't mean having answers. I thought support meant stability. I didn't realize it also meant vulnerability. There were days after our conversation when I felt overwhelmed by regret. Not the loud kind, the quiet kind that shows up when you're alone. I'd be washing dishes, and suddenly I'd remember her standing in the kitchen that day telling me she was pregnant. I'd be folding laundry, and I'd think about the nights she cried without calling for me. I'd be sitting still, and my mind would go back to all the moments I stayed silent because I thought it was best. Regret has a way of sneaking into ordinary moments. But over time, I learned something important. Regret doesn't have to paralyze you. It can teach you, if you let it. I stopped seeing that season of my life as a failure and started seeing it as a lesson I paid dearly for. A lesson about emotional presence, a lesson about courage, a lesson about how love needs language. I also had to forgive myself. That part took time because it's hard to forgive yourself for something you didn't even realize you were doing wrong at the time. But I had to remind myself that I did the best I could with what I knew then. And now that I know better, I have a responsibility to do better. That understanding changed how I show up in relationships now. I don't wait as long to speak. I don't assume silence means strength. I don't tell myself that staying quiet is the same as staying connected. I check in more. I ask questions even when I'm afraid of the answers. I sit with discomfort instead of stepping away from it, because I know what happens when you don't. I see it clearly now. That quiet distance that grew between us back then didn't start with one big mistake. It started with many small ones. Moments that felt insignificant. Choices that felt reasonable. And that's what makes them dangerous. Because quiet mistakes don't feel like mistakes at all. They feel like patience. They feel like respect. They feel like maturity. Until one day you realize what they cost. I think about the women listening to this. Women who were taught to be strong, to hold things together, to not lean too heavily on anyone. Women who learned early on that being emotional made life harder. If that's you, I want you to know something. Your feelings matter. Your voice matters. And the people you love need to hear it. Silence may keep the peace for a moment, but it doesn't build closeness. Connection requires courage. It requires saying things like, I'm here, I care, I want to understand. I wish I had known that sooner. I wish I had understood that during her pregnancy, what she needed most wasn't advice or solutions. She needed reassurance. She needed warmth. She needed to feel like she wasn't carrying everything alone. That realization still stays with me, not as punishment, but as guidance. Because every time I'm tempted to stay quiet now, I remember what silence cost me then, and I choose differently. That's the lesson I carry forward. Not to live in regret, but to live with awareness. And awareness changes everything. As I got older, I started understanding something else, too. A lot of us weren't taught how to be emotionally present. We were taught how to survive. We learned how to keep going, how to push through, how to handle responsibilities without falling apart. And in many ways, that strength kept families standing. But strength without softness can create distance. I see that now. I see how often we confuse being strong with being silent. How often we believe love should be obvious without being spoken. But love that isn't expressed can be missed, especially during pregnancy. Pregnancy is a vulnerable season, even when someone looks capable, even when they don't complain, even when they say they're fine. I didn't understand that vulnerability back then. I thought because she was functioning, she was okay. I thought because she wasn't asking, she didn't need anything. But pregnancy changes everything. Your body changes, your identity shifts, your fears get louder at night. And when emotional support is missing during that time, the absence settles deep. It doesn't always show up right away. Sometimes it waits. I see now that my silence taught her something. It taught her how to be strong on her own. And while independence is often praised, there's a loneliness that can come with it. I never wanted to be the reason she felt she had to carry everything by herself, but intention doesn't always match impact. That's another lesson I had to learn the hard way. I started noticing how silence had shaped our relationship over the years, how she shared less, how she guarded more, how she handled things without looping me in emotionally, not because she didn't love me, but because she learned what to expect. And realizing that was painful, because it meant facing the truth that my quiet presence had trained her to stop reaching. There's a particular ache that comes with knowing you were needed, and you didn't know how to show up. I've sat with that ache. I've carried it quietly, just like I carried everything else. But this time, I didn't want silence to be the ending. So I started speaking. Not perfectly, not eloquently, just honestly. I told her things I should have said years ago. I told her I was proud of her. I told her I admired her strength. I told her I was sorry for the times I wasn't emotionally present. I didn't expect forgiveness right away. Healing doesn't move on a schedule. But speaking those words mattered, because silence had already taken enough. As I look back now, I understand that pregnancy wasn't just a moment in her life, it was a crossing, a moment where she was becoming someone new, while still needing the reassurance of where she came from. I didn't see that then. I thought adulthood meant she no longer needed that kind of closeness. But pregnancy has a way of bringing old needs back to the surface. You're not just preparing to give life, you're remembering how you were nurtured, or how you weren't. And silence during that time doesn't disappear. It echoes. I sometimes wonder how different things might have felt for her if I had sat beside her more. If I had asked, "What scares you right now?" Or, "How can I support you?" Those questions don't fix everything, but they let someone know they aren't alone. And that matters more than we realize. I also think about how silence travels through generations, how what we don't say gets passed down just as much as what we do. If a mother learns to carry things quietly, her daughter may do the same, not because she wants to, but because it's what she saw. That realization humbled me. It made me see how important emotional modeling really is. Children don't just learn how to live from what we tell them, they learn from how we show up, from what we avoid, from what we're afraid to touch. I had modeled strength without softness, and softness matters. It teaches safety. It teaches that emotions have a place to land. I think about legacy differently now, not in terms of what I leave behind materially, but in terms of what I leave behind emotionally. Do the people I love feel safe coming to me? Do they feel heard when they speak? Do they feel like their emotions matter? Those questions guide me now, because I don't want silence to be part of what I pass down. I want openness to be. I want connection to be. There's a quiet courage in speaking, especially when you weren't taught how, especially when you're afraid of saying the wrong thing. But silence has consequences too, and I've learned that the risk of speaking is often smaller than the cost of staying quiet. I think back to the woman I was during her pregnancy, trying to do the right thing, trying not to interfere, trying to respect boundaries I didn't fully understand. I don't judge her anymore. She didn't know what she didn't know, but I also don't excuse the impact of her silence. Both things can be true. You can have good intentions and still cause harm. Accepting that was part of my growth. It taught me to hold myself accountable without tearing myself down. And that balance is important, especially for women like us who often carry guilt quietly and never give ourselves permission to heal. I'm still learning, still catching myself when I want to retreat into silence, still reminding myself that presence is an action, not a personality trait. You choose it again and again, and every time you choose it, you rewrite a small part of your story. You don't erase the past, but you soften its hold on you. That's what this lesson gave me. Not a way back, but a way forward. And that matters. There are days when the weight of what I didn't say still shows up, not as sharp pain, but as a soft heaviness, the kind that settles in your chest when you least expect it. I've learned not to push that feeling away. I sit with it now, because it reminds me of what matters. It reminds me that connection is fragile, that it needs attention, that it doesn't survive on good intentions alone. I used to believe that love was something people could feel without words, and sometimes that's true, but there are seasons in life when words are necessary. Pregnancy is one of those seasons. It's a time when uncertainty is high, when emotions are close to the surface, when reassurance means more than advice ever could. I didn't understand that then. I thought being steady and calm was enough, but calm without closeness can feel like distance. And distance, even when unintentional, can wound. I think about how easy it would have been to do things differently, not dramatically, not perfectly, just differently. To sit beside her instead of across the room, to ask one more question, to say, I'm here, even if I don't have answers. Those are small things, but small things are what build trust. I also think about how many women listening right now may be holding on to words they've never spoken. Words meant for daughters, words meant for sons, words meant for people they love deeply but don't always know how to reach. If that's you, I want you to know that silence isn't your only option. It might feel safer, it might feel familiar, but it isn't always kind. Kindness sometimes means speaking up, even when your voice shakes, even when you're afraid of saying the wrong thing, because presence is felt and absence is felt too. I've had to accept that some parts of our relationship will always carry the imprint of that silent season, not in a way that defines us, but in a way that reminds us. It reminds me to stay open now, to be intentional, to not assume closeness will take care of itself, because it won't. Closeness requires effort. It requires attention. It requires vulnerability. I'm grateful that she was willing to tell me the truth, even though it was hard. That conversation could have gone differently. She could have kept it to herself. She could have stayed quiet the way I did. And if she had, I might never have known the impact of my silence. That thought alone keeps me humble. It reminds me that honesty is a gift, even when it hurts, especially when it hurts. I don't tell this story to dwell in regret. I tell it because quiet mistakes are easy to repeat if we don't look at them honestly. They blend into everyday life. They hide behind good intentions. They wait. And then, one day, you realize how much time has passed. I don't want that for anyone listening. I don't want silence to steal moments that could have been filled with connection. So, if there's someone in your life right now who's going through a vulnerable season, if there's a daughter, a granddaughter, a loved one who seems strong but distant, check in, sit with them, say something. It doesn't have to be perfect, it just has to be present. Because years from now, what they'll remember isn't whether you had the right words, they'll remember whether you showed up. And that's something worth choosing. One question asked, one pause filled with presence, one choice to sit instead of step away. During her pregnancy, I thought I had time. I thought there would be another moment, another opportunity to talk, another chance to say what mattered. But life doesn't always offer neat openings. Sometimes the moment you're in is the moment. And if it passes quietly, it doesn't announce that it won't return. I've learned that silence has a way of convincing us that things can wait, that feelings will still be there later. But emotions don't wait. They either get held or they get carried alone. I see now how much strength it took for her to carry that season by herself. And while I admire her resilience, I also mourn the support she didn't receive from me. That tension lives inside me. Pride and regret, love and responsibility, both true at the same time. I think about how often women are expected to be strong without being supported, to endure quietly, to adjust without complaint, especially Black women. Strength becomes a badge of honor, but it can also become a shield that hides unmet needs. I wish I had known how to look beyond that shield, how to say, I see your strength, but you don't have to carry this alone. That sentence alone could have changed so much. And yet here I am, learning it later than I would have liked. But learning late is still learning. And sharing this story is part of how I honor that lesson. Because silence thrives when stories aren't told, when experiences are kept private out of shame or fear or pride. I don't want that anymore. I want honesty to have a place. I want reflection to have a voice. I want women listening to know that it's okay to examine the past without being crushed by it. We didn't know everything. We did what we could with what we had. But now we know more. And knowing more gives us choices. Choices to speak. Choices to listen. Choices to show up differently. I no longer assume silence means peace. I listen for what isn't being said. I pay attention to tone, to body language, to the spaces between words, because that's often where the truth lives. If there's one thing I would go back and tell myself during that pregnancy, it would be this. Don't wait for her to ask. Offer your presence freely. Sit with her. Let her talk. Let her cry. Let her be unsure. That's not interference. That's love. I didn't understand that then. I do now. And I carry that understanding into every relationship I have today. It guides me. It keeps me aware. It reminds me that silence is a choice, and so is connection. As the years pass, I find myself thinking less about what I should have said and more about how I want to be remembered. Not remembered as perfect, not remembered as someone who always knew the right thing to do, but remembered as someone who learned, someone who was willing to look at herself honestly, someone who chose to grow, even when growth was uncomfortable. I used to think legacy was about what you leave behind. Now I understand it's also about what you pass forward. The habits, the patterns, the emotional language. I don't want silence to be part of what I hand down. I don't want the women who come after me to believe they have to be strong alone. I want them to know that strength and support can exist together. that asking for help doesn't make you weak, that offering presence doesn't make you intrusive. Those are lessons I learned late, but they're lessons I live by now. I notice how differently I listen these days. I don't rush people. I don't interrupt their feelings with solutions. I don't assume I know what they need. I ask, and then I wait. That waiting feels different now. It doesn't feel awkward. It feels intentional. I've learned that silence isn't always the enemy, but unexamined silence is. Silence used to avoid discomfort, silence used to protect ourselves at the expense of connection, that kind of silence costs too much. I still think about that pregnancy, not with the same sharp regret I once felt, but with a steady awareness. It reminds me of how easy it is to miss what matters when you don't know what to look for. And it reminds me to stay alert now, to notice the quiet moments, the moments when someone seems fine, but something in their voice says otherwise. Those moments are invitations. They're chances to step closer instead of stepping back. I don't always get it right, but I don't default to silence anymore. I speak. I ask. I show up. And every time I do, I feel like I'm honoring the lesson that pregnancy taught me long after it was over. I want you, listening to this, to know that reflection is not a punishment. It's a gift. It gives you the chance to choose differently while there's still time. If there's someone in your life who is quiet right now, don't assume they're okay. Don't assume they'll come to you. Reach out. Sit beside them. Say something simple. I'm here. Those words carry more weight than we realize. I wish I had said them sooner, but saying them now still matters. And maybe that's the quiet hope inside the story, that even when we can't go back, we can still move forward with intention, with awareness, with courage. As I bring this story to a close, I want to sit with the quiet for just a moment. Not the kind of silence that avoids, but the kind that reflects, the kind that asks you to look inward, without rushing to judge yourself. Because this story isn't about blame, it's about awareness. It's about the moments we didn't recognize as important until time showed us otherwise. I didn't know then what I know now, and neither did you. We were doing what we were taught, what we saw modeled, what felt safest at the time. That doesn't make us bad. It makes us human. But being human also means being willing to learn, to listen when the truth shows up late, to accept lessons even when they come with regret. I've learned that silence isn't neutral. It either protects connection or it slowly erodes it. And during her pregnancy, my silence did more harm than I understood. I can't take that back, but I can let it shape how I live now. I can choose presence. I can choose honesty. I can choose to speak when my instinct tells me to retreat. That choice matters. It matters in small moments. It matters in ordinary conversations. It matters when someone you love is standing in front of you, hoping to be seen. If there's one thing I hope you carry with you after listening to this, it's this. Your voice matters, not just when things are falling apart, not just when someone asks, but in the quiet seasons too, especially then. Because pregnancy, grief, change, and transition are often carried quietly. And silence during those times can feel heavier than words ever could. So speak gently. Listen fully. Show up imperfectly. Don't wait for the perfect moment. Don't assume there will be another chance. Sometimes the moment you're in is the moment that matters most. I stayed quiet once when my voice was needed. That's a mistake I can't take back. But sharing it now is my way of making sure the lesson doesn't stay silent. And if this story reaches even one person who chooses connection over quiet before regret sets in, then something good has come from it. Thank you for listening.